Myth 1, the Sword of Legends. The world imagines the samurai blade, the katana, as a weapon beyond compare, sharp enough to cut silk drifting on the wind, strong enough to slice through helmets, armor, even steel cannons. In movies and comics, the katana gleams like magic, the soul of the warrior, feared by enemies across oceans. But history tells a more complex tale. The katana was indeed an extraordinary weapon, forged with a layered technique that combined hardness and flexibility. Japanese swordsmiths were masters, folding and hammering steel to create blades that balanced sharpness with resilience. These swords could hold an edge that astonished even European travelers who first saw them in the 16th century. Yet no sword, katana or otherwise, was a miracle tool that defied physics. On the battlefield, samurai did not face unarmored foes. Warriors wore lamellar armor, called oyoroi or later dumaru, made of iron, leather, and lacquered plates bound with silk cords. Against such protection, a sword slash rarely cut clean through. Instead, battles were often decided with other weapons, long yari, spears, that kept enemies at distance, the mighty yumi, longbows, that rained arrows from afar, and eventually the thunder of teppo, matchlock guns, after 1543. One dramatic example, in the Genpei War of the 12th century, bow and arrow duels decided encounters before swords were drawn. Later, in the Sengoku era, spear formations ruled the battlefield. The katana, for all its beauty, often came into play only when lines broke, when soldiers closed to desperate, personal combat. This does not diminish the blade, it elevates it. The sword was treasured not because it was the most efficient killing tool, but because it symbolized the warrior's spirit. It was the companion at the side, the last resort, the weapon of honor when other tools failed. Lords passed swords down as heirlooms, and warriors polished them daily as if caring for their very soul. So the myth is clear, the katana could not slice through armor like paper. The fact is more fascinating, it was a weapon of precision and ritual, often secondary on the battlefield, yet eternal in meaning. As the smoke of the battlefield clears, another myth rises like dust in the wind, that the samurai always fought with swords. In truth, the story turns toward different weapons, different tactics, and battles that shattered legends. Myth 2, the samurai's true weapons. The silver screen shows the samurai as sword saints, warriors locked in duels with katanas flashing in the sunlight. Rows of men clash in a storm of blades, steel on steel, as if the battlefield were a stage for endless one-on-one contests. Yet history was harsher, larger, and more practical. The samurai were not just swordsmen, they were commanders, archers, spearmen, and later, masters of gunpowder warfare. The sword was always there, but rarely the weapon that won wars. The heart of battlefield combat was the yari, the spear. Long, straight, and tipped with steel, it extended the warrior's reach far beyond a sword arm. Some yari stretched over 4 meters, giving infantry a wall of points that could stop charging cavalry in their tracks. In disciplined formations, lines of ashigaru, foot soldiers, thrust their spears in unison, like waves crashing forward. The samurai themselves often led from horseback, but the spear was the true workhorse of combat, decisive in both attack and defense. Archery too defined the warrior class. The yumi, a massive longbow taller than most men, was curved asymmetrically so it could be fired from horseback. In the earliest samurai tales, skill with the bow was the highest mark of valor. During the Genpei War of the late 12th century, archers rode out before armies to test their skill in ritual duels. The story of Nasu no Yoichi remains legendary. When ordered to prove himself, he drew his bow and, in the salt-stung air of the inland sea, struck a small fan atop a Taira ship's mast with a single arrow. That feat was remembered for centuries, not as a sword strike, but as proof of the yumi's central place in samurai life. But the greatest transformation came not from spear or bow, but from smoke, fire, and iron. In 1543, a drifting Chinese vessel carrying Portuguese traders landed on Tanegashima Island. Among their wares were matchlock firearms, teppo in Japanese. What began as a curiosity became a revolution. Within a decade, Japanese smiths were producing guns in the thousands. Within a generation, they reshaped the art of war. The most famous example thundered in 1575 at the Battle of Nagashino. The Takeda clan, famed for their cavalry, charged against Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Instead of meeting horse with sword, Nobunaga lined his men behind wooden stockades and placed hundreds of gunners in rotating ranks. While one line fired, another reloaded, and another prepared to shoot again. The result was devastating. Wave after wave of cavalry fell, unable to break through the storm of lead. The myth of the sword clashing as the central weapon of war shattered on that field. Spears held the lines, guns tore them apart, and bows still filled the skies with arrows. The katana? It remained at the warrior's hip, drawn only when the formations broke, or in duels of desperation. It is important to see the sword not as the main weapon of the samurai, but as the ever-present symbol of his station. A spear could be left on the field. A bow might be broken. A gun might misfire. But the sword was constant, always near, always ready. In this way, it became the badge of the warrior class. By the Edo period, when peace ruled the land, the sword's symbolic weight only grew, because on peaceful streets there were no battlefields of yari and teppo, only the polished katana at a samurai's side to mark who he was. Still, during the centuries of war, victory was forged by weapons that reached farther and struck harder than a blade. The samurai may be remembered as swordsmen, but they lived as generals of spears, bows, and fire. Yet when we speak of battle, another myth lingers in the shadows, that only men took up arms, and that women stood aside. In truth, history remembers fierce women who raised the naginata and the bow, defending castles and clans when the storm of war came crashing down. Myth 3: Women didn't fight. The story of the samurai is often told as a man's tale, armored warriors riding beneath banners, their blades flashing as they carve history. In paintings, woodblock prints, and films, women are pushed to the background, silent wives, grieving widows, or delicate court ladies. The myth suggests that women had no place in war. But Japanese history tells another story, one of courage, tragedy, and defiance. Among the warrior class existed the onabugeisha, women of the bushi, warrior families, trained in arms to defend their homes, their clans, and their honor. Their weapon of choice was often the naginata, a long polearm topped with a curved blade. Its reach allowed women, sometimes physically smaller than male warriors, to fight with leverage and distance. They also trained with bows, knives, and even swords. But more important than the weapon was the role, guardians of the household, protectors of their people when husbands and fathers marched to war. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from the late Heian period, Tomo Guzan. She fought in the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, serving Minamoto no Yashinaka. Chronicles describe her as beautiful and deadly, a rider of unmatched skill, capable of facing any man in battle. At the Battle of Awazu, as her lord was overwhelmed, Tomo is said to have cut down powerful warriors before vanishing into history. Whether every detail is true or embellished, her name became legend. She was remembered not as a bystander, but as a commander who rode at the front. Centuries later, during the Sengoku era, the age of warring states, women stood as the last line of defense in castles under siege. When enemies came, they could not wait for reinforcements. They fought. In 1584, during the siege of Ashi, it was Lady Kaiheim, daughter of a retainer, who rallied defenders and repelled assaults. Armed with naginata and bow, she became known as the Beauty of Ashi Castle, both admired and feared. Another striking story belongs to Nakano Takiko, though she lived later, during the Boshin War of the 19th century, when samurai society was crumbling. Leading a unit of women known as the Joshitai, she fought at the Battle of Aizu in 1868. With her naginata in hand, she charged into enemy lines. Wounded by gunfire, she chose to die by her sister's sword rather than be captured. Her grave was honored by comrades, and her memory became a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. These women were not isolated anomalies. Archaeological studies of battlefields, such as in Nagano Prefecture, have uncovered remains showing that women sometimes made up significant numbers of defenders in sieges. Their presence in war was not fantasy, it was necessity. Clans understood that survival demanded every able body. And yet, the myth persisted because of how history was later written. Chronicles, often penned by men in courts or temples, emphasized male exploits, leaving women's stories in the margins. During the Edo period, when peace reigned and samurai became bureaucrats rather than warriors, the image of the obedient, restrained samurai wife was promoted as ideal. The reality of women warriors faded into legend, remembered only in local tales, family scrolls, and rare chronicles. So the myth that women did not fight crumbles when one peers into the smoke of sieges and the cries of castle walls. Women did fight, sometimes as leaders, sometimes as defenders, always as warriors in their own right. The battlefield, then, was never only male. And this truth leads to another myth, that the samurai code, Bushido, was eternal, ancient, and unchanging. But just as war shifted, so too did ideals. The code was not set in stone, it evolved with time, shaped by victory, defeat, and peace. Myth 4, Bushido was an ancient, unchanging code. Few words today carry as much mystique as Bushido, the way of the warrior. In popular imagination, it is an eternal creed, etched into the hearts of samurai across centuries, loyalty unto death, courage in the face of hopeless odds, honor above all. Films and novels speak of it as if it had been handed down unchanged from the dawn of the samurai to their final bow in the 19th century. But this, too, is a myth. The truth is more fluid, more human. Bushido was not a fixed code, it was an evolving set of ideals that shifted with the needs of the age. In the earliest centuries of samurai warfare, from the late Heian into the Kamakura period, there was no formalized Bushido. Warriors lived by clan loyalty and survival. Service to one's daimyo, lord, was vital, but so too was family prestige, land, and wealth. Betrayals and shifting allegiances were common, and many warriors changed sides if fortune demanded it. The ideal of absolute loyalty existed in poetry and chronicles, but the battlefield often told another story. During the Nanbakucho and Sengoku eras, when war engulfed the land, practicality ruled. Samurai were expected to fight, scheme, and endure. Honor mattered, but so did results. Generals like Takeda Shingen and Yasuji Kenshin used spies, bribes, and ambushes alongside valor in open combat. The idea of Bushido was alive, but it was not yet a sacred, unified doctrine. It was a blend of Confucian duty, Buddhist acceptance of death, and native warrior traditions, all shifting with the chaos of the time. The crystallization of Bushido came later, ironically, in an age of peace. After 1600, with Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara and the dawn of the Edo period, Japan entered 2.5 centuries of stability. With large-scale wars gone, samurai became administrators, scholars, and guards rather than constant fighters. In this new world, thinkers and writers began to shape Bushido into a philosophy of conduct rather than a record of battlefield behavior. Texts like Hagakure, early 18th century, and Budo Shoshinshu set out ideals of absolute loyalty, readiness for death, and moral integrity. These writings did not describe how medieval samurai always lived, they prescribed how Edo-era samurai ought to live. Bushido became as much aspiration as reality. One striking example, Yamamoto Tsunetomo, author of Hagakure, insisted that, the way of the warrior is found in death. Yet he himself served in an era when samurai had little opportunity to die in battle. His words reflected a longing for the old age of war, transformed into philosophy during peace. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bushido was further reshaped. In the Meiji period, when Japan sought to modernize and define itself against the West, Bushido was reimagined as a timeless code, tied to nationalism and identity. It became a cultural symbol, even influencing military propaganda in the early 20th century. Thus, the myth of an ancient, unchanging Bushido is revealed for what it is, a story woven backward, projecting ideals onto centuries of diverse, shifting warrior behavior. The real Bushido was not carved in stone but written and rewritten across ages, reflecting the needs of clans, shoguns, and later, the nation. This truth leads naturally into the next legend, that samurai and ninja, warriors and spies, were eternal enemies locked in shadow wars. But history tells us a quieter truth, one of cooperation, secrecy, and blurred lines. Myth 5, Ninja and samurai were eternal enemies. In modern stories, the samurai and the ninja stand as opposites, one in the light, the other in shadow. The samurai, armored and noble, embody honor and loyalty. The ninja, cloaked in black, slip through rooftops with poison and blades, assassins without code or name. Films, anime, and games fuel this image of eternal rivalry, the disciplined warrior versus the treacherous spy. But history paints a different picture. The line between samurai and shinobi, covert agents, was never so sharp. The word ninja itself is a modern reading. In their own time, they were called shinobi no mano, people who endure. They were scouts, infiltrators, and agents of sabotage. Their tasks ranged from spreading rumors to setting fires, from espionage to assassination. But they were not an entirely separate caste of shadow warriors living outside society. Many were farmers called upon in war. Some were samurai themselves, trained in covert tactics. Others were simply specialists hired by daimyo, lords, who needed more than steel in the open field. One famous example lies in the late Sengoku period. Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who sought to unify Japan, employed shinobi in his campaigns. The Iga and Koga regions were known for producing such agents, trained in the art of infiltration. In 1579 and again in 1581, Nobunaga led massive assaults against the Iga clans, crushing their autonomy. Yet even as he fought them, he later employed surviving shinobi in his service. Here, the supposed eternal enemy became ally, folded into the machinery of war. Even more telling is the role of Hattori Hanzo, a name that echoes across legend. Hanzo was not a faceless rogue, but a samurai retainer of the Tokugawa clan. He was famed for both battlefield valor and covert skills. When Tokugawa Ieyasu's family was threatened in Kyoto, Hanzo guided them through enemy territory to safety, using the stealth and deception often attributed to ninja. Was he a ninja? A samurai? In truth, he was both. The categories were never as separate as myth suggests. The idea of ninja as masked assassins clashing eternally with armored samurai is largely the creation of later centuries, especially Edo period theater and, much later, modern popular culture. For audiences, the contrast between light and shadow was irresistible. The samurai needed a dark mirror, and the shinobi became that figure. But in reality, they were tools of the same system. Lords hired them, samurai commanded them, and sometimes samurai themselves acted as shinobi. This truth reveals something important: war was not fought only with swords and spears in the open field. It was fought in whispers, in ambushes, in quiet sabotage. Victory required not just strength, but cunning. And yet, while ninja have been exaggerated into mythic foes, another legend lingers, that duels between individuals decided the fate of wars. But the true power behind victory was not single combat. It was strategy, alliances, and even the weather itself. Myth 6, Duels Decided Wars. The image is burned deep into legend: two warriors step forward, banners flapping behind them, their blades gleaming. A hush falls over the battlefield as samurai lock eyes, and the duel begins. One clash, one strike, and the destiny of entire clans is decided in that moment of steel against steel. This is the story that echoes in kabuki plays, in novels, in movies. But the reality of Japanese warfare was far larger, far more brutal, and far less romantic. Individual duels could happen, yes, but wars were decided by logistics, numbers, and strategy. It was the weight of supplies, the strength of alliances, and even the mercy, or fury, of weather that crowned victors. Consider the Battle of Okahazuma, 1560. Imagawa Yoshimoto marched with nearly 25,000 men, intending to sweep into Kyoto and seize power. Facing him was Oda Nobunaga with perhaps 2,000. By the myth of duels, Yoshimoto's overwhelming strength should have crushed Nobunaga in a single heroic clash. But Nobunaga did not seek open challenge. He struck with cunning. Using the cover of a sudden thunderstorm, he launched a surprise assault on Yoshimoto's camp. Confused, blinded by rain and thunder, the Imagawa forces collapsed. Yoshimoto himself was cut down not in a grand duel, but in the chaos of ambush. From this victory, Nobunaga began his rise to power. Another example towers above all others, the Battle of Sekigahara, 1600. Here, nearly 160,000 warriors clashed, the largest battle ever fought on Japanese soil. On one side, Tokugawa Ieyasu commanded the Eastern Army, on the other, Ishida Mitsunari led the Western coalition. Popular imagination might suggest this was settled by the courage of individual champions. In truth, it was decided by betrayal and positioning. Several daimyo of the Western Army, secretly aligned with Tokugawa, defected mid-battle. As they switched banners, Ishida's forces collapsed. Sekigahara was not a stage for single combat, it was a contest of diplomacy, deception, and timing. The outcome crowned Tokugawa as the ruler of Japan for the next 250 years. This is not to say duels never mattered. Samurai culture valued them, and chronicles preserved tales of personal combat. Warriors like Miyamoto Musashi, famed for winning over 60 duels, became legends. But Musashi's victories did not topple clans or end wars, they carved his personal fame, not the destiny of the nation. The battlefield itself was rarely suited for duels. Clouds of arrows, spear thrusts in packed formations, musket fire, and cavalry charges left little room for orderly one-on-one contests. The clash of thousands was not a stage for elegant combat, it was survival. Thus the myth of duels deciding wars falls away. Wars were not stories of two blades meeting under heaven, but of storms, supply chains, terrain, and human betrayal. The duel might win honor. The strategy won kingdoms. And yet, while the duel is romanticized, another myth grows from the same soil, that samurai never retreated, that they fought to the last man without faltering. But the truth shows otherwise. Retreat, ambush, and deception were tools of victory just as sharp as any blade. Myth 7, Samurai never retreated. The myth is simple and heroic, the samurai, bound by honor, never turned their backs on the enemy. They fought to the last breath, every battle ending in either victory or death. In paintings and popular stories, they are depicted as iron-willed warriors standing firm even as arrows and flames consume the field. To retreat, the legend claims, was shameful beyond redemption. But history reveals a different truth. Samurai were warriors, yes, but also strategists and survivors. They retreated when it was wise, regrouped when it was necessary, and often turned withdrawal into cunning advantage. Far from dishonorable, retreat was one of the many tools in the art of war. A striking example comes from Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant commander of the late 12th century. At the Battle of Ichinatani in 1184, he feigned retreat, drawing Taira forces into pursuit. Once the enemy line stretched thin, Yoshitsune wheeled around and struck from a mountain pass, shattering the opposition. His cowardly withdrawal was in fact a masterstroke of deception. Centuries later, during the Sengoku era, retreat was a common tactic in the chessboard of war. Armies were vast, supplies limited, and terrain unforgiving. No commander could afford to squander men in battles already lost. At Kanagasaki in 1570, Oda Nobunaga himself executed a daring withdrawal when surrounded by superior forces. Far from being disgraced, he preserved his army, lived to fight again, and within a decade reshaped the nation. Even the mighty Takeda clan, famed for their cavalry, used retreat as a calculated maneuver. Takeda Shingen, often praised as one of Japan's greatest generals, employed ambushes and withdrawals to lure enemies into traps. His rival, Usuji Kenshin, did the same. These men were celebrated for their wisdom, not condemned for avoiding suicidal charges. Why, then, does the myth endure? In part, because of later writings like the Hagakure, which idealized death over retreat. The way of the warrior is found in death, wrote Yamamoto Tsunetomo. His words, however, were not a reflection of battlefield reality in his own peaceful Edo period, but rather a romanticized vision of an earlier age. The true warriors of Sengoku Japan did not fling lives away without purpose. They fought to win, and winning often meant pulling back today to strike harder tomorrow. Retreat could also preserve honor in another way. Samurai valued loyalty to their lords, and dying needlessly might rob their clan of service in the next campaign. Living to fight again could be the truest form of loyalty. So the image of samurai as immovable statues of honor, never retreating, is not history, it is legend, polished by storytellers long after the battles ended. The truth is more practical, retreats were strategic, sometimes brilliant, and often the very reason a clan survived. And yet, the idea of retreat connects to another myth, one that fascinates outsiders, the image of seppuku, ritual suicide, as a casual, almost daily act among samurai. But just as with retreat, the reality was far rarer, more ritualized, and far more complex than legend suggests. Myth 8, seppuku was frequent and casual. Few images of the samurai grip the imagination as tightly as seppuku, ritual suicide by cutting the belly, often called harakiri. Films and books suggest that samurai ended their lives this way almost casually, performing it after every failure, every defeat, every slight against their honor. The myth paints a world where warriors lived one moment and, with stoic calm, disemboweled themselves the next, their lives thrown away like blossoms in the wind. But history reveals a much more restrained and solemn reality. Seppuku was not casual. It was not common. It was a rare, ritualized act reserved for extraordinary circumstances, often bound up in politics as much as honor. The practice emerged in the late Heian and early Kamakura periods, originally as a way for defeated warriors to avoid capture and disgrace. In an age when enemies often executed captives brutally or displayed their heads as trophies, taking one's own life could deny the enemy that victory. It was an act of control, the warrior determined his own end. Yet seppuku was not a private choice alone. Over time, it became highly formalized, especially during the Edo period. A condemned samurai might be ordered to commit seppuku by his lord or by the shogunate. In such cases, the ritual followed strict procedure. A second, called the kaishakunin, would stand ready with a sword. After the condemned opened his abdomen with a short blade, the second would swiftly decapitate him, ensuring the death was quick and sparing him prolonged agony. The act was not done lightly, it was theater, justice, and statement all in one. One of the most famous examples comes from the tale of the 47 ronin in 1703. After avenging their lord by killing his rival, the ronin surrendered. The shogunate, balancing law with recognition of their loyalty, ordered them to commit seppuku. Each man performed the ritual, their deaths remembered not as casual, but as solemn acts of loyalty and closure to a saga of vengeance. Yet such episodes stand out precisely because they were unusual. The majority of samurai did not die by seppuku. Most fell in battle, perished of illness, or lived to old age. Even among those who failed their lords or lost wars, many simply faded into obscurity or became ronin, masterless wanderers. The myth that samurai routinely took their lives is a distortion, born from the fascination of later storytellers who elevated rare acts into symbols of the entire class. During the peaceful Edo era, writers like Yamamoto Tsunetomo in Hagakure glorified death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. His words, "The way of the warrior is found in death," were taken by later generations as literal truth. In reality, they were philosophy, not practice. Few samurai of his day ever unsheathed a blade against their own body. Even in the 19th century, when Japan confronted Western powers, seppuku was invoked less as a common act and more as a symbol of ultimate loyalty to tradition. It shocked outsiders precisely because it was unfamiliar, rare, and charged with cultural meaning. So the myth collapses: seppuku was not frequent, not casual, and never trivial. It was rare, solemn, and deeply symbolic, reserved for moments of crisis or punishment. Its power lies not in how often it was performed, but in how deeply it was remembered. And from this, we turn to yet another myth, that all samurai were noble heroes, paragons of virtue beyond corruption. But history shows that beneath the armor and ideals was a human class, flawed, ambitious, and often ruthless. Myth 9: Samurai were all noble heroes. In the legends, the samurai are remembered as paragons of virtue, stalwart guardians of justice, champions of the weak, warriors who lived only for loyalty and died only for honor. They are painted as flawless knights of the East, noble in every deed and thought. But history, as always, is more complicated. The samurai were human. They were a social class, not a race of saints. Among them lived courage and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, generosity and greed. At their height, the samurai made up nearly 10% of Japan's population. They were not a handful of legendary warriors, they were an estate, a ruling class, with all the politics, rivalries, and divisions of any elite. Some fought bravely and selflessly. Others plotted, schemed, and crushed the weak beneath their boots. To remember only the noble side is to forget half the truth. Consider the Unin War, 1467 to 1477, the conflict that plunged Japan into the Warring States period. It began not as a righteous crusade, but as a dispute over succession to the shogunate. Samurai lords chose sides, Kyoto burned, and common people suffered in the crossfire. The city's destruction was so great that it never fully recovered to its former splendor. This was not the work of noble heroes, it was ambition unleashed, rival houses tearing each other apart. Even at the level of individual lords, honor was often mixed with cruelty. Takeda Shingen, celebrated as a brilliant general, was also ruthless in crushing dissent. Oda Nobunaga, who rose from minor lord to near unifier of Japan, was feared for his brilliance and his severity. At Mount High in 1571, he ordered the burning of the Enryakuji monastery, slaughtering warrior monks and civilians alike. Such acts are remembered not as noble, but as ruthless necessities in the eyes of the victors. At the lower levels, samurai also struggled with debts, land disputes, and infighting. Many lived not as grand lords but as modest retainers, constantly seeking stipends from their daimyo. Rivalries between samurai families sometimes erupted into blood feuds, leaving trails of vengeance that spanned generations. A samurai could be as prone to greed or corruption as any bureaucrat, and many used their positions to exploit peasants or enrich themselves. And yet, to call the samurai hypocrites would be equally false. Within this class were genuine heroes, men and women who defended their people, who kept faith even unto death, who left behind stories that inspired centuries. Figures like Kusunoki Masashige, who fought with unshakable loyalty to Emperor Go-Daigo, or the famed 47 ronin, who avenged their lord despite knowing their deaths were certain, remind us that honor was real, even if not universal. The myth of the samurai as universally noble was largely polished in later centuries, especially during the Edo period. With warfare ended, scholars and writers looked back at the bloodshed of earlier times and chose to highlight ideals rather than realities. Plays, scrolls, and eventually novels elevated the samurai into role models, symbols of discipline and integrity. By the 20th century, this image became global, samurai as Japan's knights, their flaws smoothed away by time and myth. But the truth, richer and deeper, is that the samurai were human. Some were heroes. Some were villains. Most were something in between, caught in the struggle of ambition, loyalty, and survival. And from this truth comes the final myth in our journey, that the samurai vanished overnight with the dawn of the Meiji era, swept away like shadows at sunrise. But their story did not end so suddenly. The samurai transformed, and their legacy lived on. Myth 10, the samurai vanished overnight in Meiji. The story often told is one of sudden disappearance. The year is 1868, the emperor is restored, the Meiji government rises, and the samurai vanish overnight. Their top knots are cut, their swords banned, their castles dismantled. The myth suggests a clean break, as if centuries of tradition dissolved in a single decree. But history reveals a more gradual transformation. The samurai class did not vanish in an instant. They adapted, reshaped, and in many ways carried their legacy into the modern age. The end of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868 did indeed shatter the old order. The new Meiji government, eager to modernize and compete with Western powers, abolished feudal domains and stripped the samurai of their hereditary stipends. By the 1870s, laws restricted the wearing of swords in public. On paper, the samurai class ceased to exist. And yet, many former samurai found new roles. Their education, discipline, and organizational skills made them natural candidates for positions in the modern army, police, and government. Others became teachers, administrators, or businessmen, carrying their sense of duty into new arenas. The new Imperial Japanese Army, formed in the late 19th century, was filled with former samurai officers who infused the institution with martial values. Some resisted the changes. The most famous was Seigo Takamori, often called the Last Samurai. Once a leader of the Meiji Restoration, he grew disillusioned with the reforms that stripped samurai privileges. In 1877, he led the Satsuma Rebellion, a revolt of disaffected warriors who could not accept the new order. At Shiroyama, his outnumbered army faced the modern conscript forces of the government. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Seigo's rebellion was crushed. His death did not mark the extinction of the samurai spirit, but the end of their political power. Even after the legal abolition of their class, the legacy of the samurai lingered. Their values, loyalty, discipline, sacrifice, were reinterpreted to serve the nation as a whole. Writers and educators in the Meiji period reframed Bushido as a timeless, national ethic, a way to inspire unity and strength in the modern state. The samurai disappeared as a legal class, but as symbols, they became immortal. By the early 20th century, the samurai spirit was invoked to define Japan's identity on the world stage. And even today, the fascination remains global. The armor, the sword, the code, all continue to inspire, centuries after the last samurai laid down his arms. So the myth of disappearance collapses. The samurai did not vanish overnight. They transformed, leaving behind not a void, but a living legacy woven into Japan's modern fabric. From the myth of the sword that cut through steel, to the myth of women's silence, to the myth of Bushido as eternal law, we have journeyed through shadows and truth. The samurai were not unearthly heroes, nor were they shadows that faded in an instant. They were human, brave, flawed, ambitious, loyal, and cunning. Their story is not less grand because it is real. It is greater, because reality reveals a world where men and women lived, fought, and died, shaping history with every choice. The myths endure because they are simple. But the facts endure because they are true. And in those truths, the samurai stand not as fantasy, but as part of the living history of Japan, complex, human, and unforgettable. Thank you for watching Samurai, Myths vs. Facts. If you enjoyed this journey into history, where legends meet truth, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic stories of warriors, battles, and the past brought to life.